The sky was dark, cloaked in gray clouds, as if even heaven was mourning. Just any officer, he was a symbol of progress, integrity, and unshakable patriotism. A black man who had risen through the ranks to become one of the most respected generals in modern U.S. military history. His story was the embodiment of the American dream. But no one at the service could have anticipated that his final farewell would be desecrated by one man's hatred, and that it would ignite a firestorm that would change the nation. Family, friends, fellow soldiers, and members of Congress stood, shoulder to shoulder, in silence as the flag-draped casket rested on a black marble platform. Folded hands, bowed heads, and soft sniffles filled the space. The chaplain was moments away from beginning his prayer when a loud commotion erupted near the main gate. It started with shouting, then came the screaming. At first, most attendees thought it might be a protest. The general had his critics' powerful voices, who didn't like that a black man commanded forces once dominated by the old guard. But nothing could prepare them for the chilling sight of a white police officer rushing into the cemetery. Gun drawn, eyes wild. "Get down on the ground, now," he barked, voice cracking with rage. Gasps spread through the crowd like wildfire. People ducked. Mothers grabbed their children. Veterans instinctively shielded the elders beside them. But one man, Colonel Desmond Hayes, stood his ground, the officer identified later as Deputy Travis Rourke of the Fayette County Sheriff's Department, had fixated on Desmond. The colonel, dressed in his formal blues with 4 bronze stars on his lapel, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the general himself. And that resemblance had cost him more than his peace, it nearly cost him his life. "You match the description," Rourke shouted, finger tightening on the trigger. "Hands behind your head." Desmond, stunned but composed, raised his hand slowly. "Officer, I'm a United States Army colonel. That's my commanding officer in that casket." But logic had no place in the deputy's world. His hands didn't shake out of fear. They shook with something far uglier: rage, hatred, ignorance. Rourke didn't ask for ID. He didn't request backup. He didn't radio for clarification. All he saw was a black man in a position of honor. And in his mind, Rourke, from pulling the trigger, the weapon was snatched from his hand, and he was wrestled to the ground. But the damage was done. The moment had been filmed dozens of angles. Phones had captured it. National media picked it up within hours. By sundown, the headlines were everywhere. "Armed cop interrupts military funeral. Targets black officer." Hidden Sparks uploaded the raw footage the next morning, and within minutes it went viral. The images spoke louder than words. A man with a gun pointed at a grieving officer in full uniform, the American flag in the background, the coffin only feet away. No amount of denial could erase what the nation had seen. By noon the next day, Desmond Hayes stood at a press conference, flanked by fellow officers and the general's widow. His voice was calm, but his words cut through the silence like a blade. "I've served this country with honor. I've bled in foreign lands so that Americans can sleep peacefully at night. And yet, in my own country, at the funeral of a friend, I was treated like a criminal because of my skin." The room was silent, but America wasn't. Protests ignited in over 30 cities. Military officials condemned the act. Veterans organizations released a joint statement calling it a betrayal of the principles our flag stands for. "It was not just an act of racism," said Senator Leila Marino. "It was an act of terror." The sheriff's department attempted damage control, claiming that Rourke had received a report of a dangerous armed suspect matching the colonel's description. But no such report existed. The call logs were empty. The dispatch had nothing to show. Rourke had acted on his own. Under pressure, the department placed him on administrative leave. But that wasn't enough. Not for Desmond, not for the general's family, not for the thousands of servicemen and women. Who knew what had happened was bigger than one man. It was a symbol of everything they'd been fighting to change. Hidden Sparks continued to follow the story closely. We spoke to eyewitnesses. We interviewed the general's driver, who confirmed that Rourke had attempted to enter the funeral site twice earlier, but had been told he wasn't authorized. "He didn't look like he was here for security," the driver said. "He looked like he was here to confront someone, and confront he did." Desmond Hayes filed a federal lawsuit. Civil rights organizations rallied behind him. The general's family demanded criminal charges and behind the scenes. Something unprecedented was building: an indictment for hate crime and attempted murder. When the footage was presented to a federal grand jury, there was no debate. Rourke was arrested at his home 2 weeks later, charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, hate-motivated intent, and disruption of a military funeral, a federal felony. He didn't speak as they cuffed him, but he looked shocked. He truly believed he'd walk away. But justice was just beginning to stir, and the country was watching. The courtroom was silent, so silent that one could hear the shuffle of papers, the occasional clearing of a throat, the soft clicking of a ballpoint pen. But beneath the surface, tension simmered like a powder keg ready to blow. The country had already rendered its verdict in the court of public opinion. But now, it was up to the justice system to answer a question that had haunted America for generations. Would a white officer finally be held accountable for targeting a black man in uniform? Deputy Travis Rourke sat in the defendant's chair, dressed in a gray suit that did little to soften the scowl. Gone was the arrogance, the bravado, the sneer he wore so proudly that day at the cemetery. Now, his eyes were rimmed with dark circles, his hands twitching nervously under the table. No badge to hide behind, no gun on his hip, just a man who had let his prejudice explode in the most sacred of places and got caught across the aisle. Colonel Desmond Hayes sat straight-backed in his decorated Army blues. Rows of medals lined his chest, not out of vanity, but as quiet reminders of sacrifice. He didn't want to be here, but he had no choice. This was no longer just about him, it was about every soldier of color who had saluted. A flag that didn't always salute them back. The prosecution didn't waste time. They played the video again. The same one that had gone viral on Hidden Sparks, this time in a courtroom packed with reporters, activists, veterans, and legal experts. The footage was raw. Rourke's voice was clear. His words were unmistakable. "Get down on the ground now." A courtroom officer pressed pause just as Rourke raised his weapon. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "This is not a case of mistaken identity. This is a case of racial profiling. This is a hate crime." This officer didn't see a colonel. He didn't see a grieving man. He saw a black face and decided he was the enemy. The defense tried to paint a different picture. They claimed Rourke had been responding to a vague tip, one that never materialized in evidence. They said he was under stress, that he felt threatened, that Desmond Hayes had moved too suddenly. But the jury wasn't buying it. Neither was America. Outside the courthouse, vigils turned to marches. In New York, 1 million veterans and civilians walked side by side under the banner salute, "Don't shoot." In Georgia, billboards lit up with Desmond's image and the words, "This hero deserves justice." Hidden Sparks released a documentary recounting the general's life, Desmond's military career, and the moment hate tried to overshadow honor. It amassed over 20 million views in 4 days. Inside, this wasn't his first offense. Internal documents, leaked during the proceedings, showed that Rourke had been disciplined twice. Before, for excessive force, once involving a Latino teenager, and another involving a black father who was detained while jogging. Both cases had been quietly settled. Both had disappeared into the system like dust into wind. Now they were center stage. The turning point came on the 4th day. Desmond Hayes took the stand. He wasn't emotional, he wasn't angry, he was resolute. "I didn't want this attention," he said. "I didn't ask for cameras or lawsuits or speeches. All I wanted was to bury my commanding officer with honor. That's all." But what happened that day wasn't just about me. It was about every child who sees someone in uniform and thinks, maybe one day that could be me. What message do we send when even in that uniform, our lives are still seen as threats? The room went still. Even Rourke's attorney lowered his eyes. Desmond's testimony shattered any remaining illusion that this was just a misunderstanding. The truth was laid bare. This had been racial hatred, wearing a badge by the final day. The courtroom overflowed with press. Cameras couldn't enter, but sketches of Desmond and Rourke splashed across every major news outlet. President Mitchell released a statement expressing deep concern over the rise in racially motivated confrontations against black service members. The Pentagon issued a review of military funeral protocols to increase security against internal domestic threats. Then came the verdict, guilty on all counts. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, hate crime under federal statute, unlawful, disruption of a military funeral, the final sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courtroom didn't erupt in cheers. There were no dramatic outbursts, just a heavy, long breath, like a nation exhaling after holding it in for far too long. Rourke didn't say a word. He didn't look at Desmond. He didn't cry. He simply stood as the judge read the sentence, then was led away by 2 U.S. Marshals. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be judged, and this time there was no escaping it. Outside, Desmond addressed the crowd. This isn't a victory. This is accountability. And accountability is only the beginning. We've still got work to do. His words echoed across social media. #SaluteDon'tShoot became a global trend. Military academies started mandatory bias training. Civilians reached out to servicemen and women with messages of solidarity. Rourke, meanwhile, disappeared behind prison walls. But what he did would not be forgotten, because justice, when it finally comes, isn't always loud. Sometimes it moves in silence, in uniforms, in folded flags, and in the quiet, unwavering dignity of a man who refuses to back down. And that's where the next chapter begins. Months passed. The trial was over. The media circus had settled, and the noise had dulled. But the scars left behind didn't fade. For many, the incident at General Elijah Brooks' funeral was no longer just a moment. It had become a movement. It shook institutions, challenged traditions, and reminded a nation that no matter how polished the uniforms, how folded the flags, or how high the ranks, racism could still walk through the gates of a cemetery and try to erase everything. This time it didn't win. Colonel Desmond Hayes returned to duty just 2 weeks after the sentencing. But nothing felt the same. At every military base he visited, young cadets would salute him with a firmness that wasn't just about rank, it was about respect. Quiet nods from generals, emotional thank yous from janitors, folded notes left on his desk with words like, "Because of you I stayed in." Across the country, legislation began to shift. A bipartisan bill named the General Brooks Act passed through Congress with sweeping support. It required all local law enforcement officers to undergo yearly anti-bias training and established a federal oversight task force for hate crimes committed by officers, especially those targeting active-duty service members and veterans. The bill wasn't just ink on paper, it was backed by the roar of millions who had seen what had happened and refused to look away. Hidden Sparks released a follow-up documentary titled "The Day Honor Was Interrupted," chronicling the aftermath, the cultural reckoning, and the personal toll on Desmond and the general's family. It opened with the same haunting image, a casket, a gun, and a nation frozen in disbelief. But it ended differently. Children in uniform, hands on hearts, whispering the name Elijah Brooks like a vow. Even from prison, Rourke remained a subject of public curiosity. His name became a symbol not of fear, but of what happens when hatred is dragged into the light. Inside the federal facility where he served his life sentence, he was reportedly isolated, not for safety, but because no one wanted to associate with him. Guards looked through him. Inmates ignored him. He wasn't feared, he was forgotten. But Desmond hadn't forgotten. He COULDN, single quotes, T1 autumn morning. Nearly a year after the funeral, he returned to the cemetery alone this time. Cameras, no press, just him and the rustle of leaves dancing across the polished stones. He stood in front of the general's grave, a fresh bouquet in hand, and let the silence speak for them both. "You wouldn't believe what's happened, sir," he said softly. "You were supposed to rest in peace. I made sure of it." Behind him, a quiet shuffle interrupted his moment. It was the general's widow, Gloria Brooks, elegant and strong, as always. She placed her hand on Desmond's shoulder. "He'd be proud of you," she said. "You did more than honor him. You protected all of us." They stood together in silence as the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden beam across the engraved words, "General Elijah D. Brooks, a soldier's soldier." And still, the ripples spread at the West Point Military Academy. A scholarship was established in the general's name, exclusively for students of color pursuing leadership positions in the military. Its mission, to ensure that no one would ever question whether a black officer belonged at the top. Meanwhile, Desmond became an advisor for the Department of Defense, helping to shape future training programs focused on race, service, and the dangers of unchecked power in law enforcement. His name became one of those whispered in high halls, admired, respected, and, most of all, believed. What happened that day had started as one man's act of hatred, but it ended in a country's awakening, and in the quiet corners of America, military bases, schools, churches, young black boys began drawing pictures of themselves in uniforms, with stars on their collars and pride in their hearts, because now they'd seen someone survive it, someone stand tall, someone walk through fire and come out leading the way. Hidden Sparks closed its final update with a simple message. When you salute a soldier, you salute the sacrifice, not the skin. Let this be the last time a man in uniform is seen as a threat instead of a hero. The video faded out to a single image, Desmond standing beside General Brooks' headstone, hand on his heart, the American flag behind him rippling in the wind. No guns, no threats, just honor. And that's how the story ended, not with vengeance, but with victory. Because hate might shout, but truth stands forever.